In a vast, sunlit arena, the black-haired man in gladiator armor stood dazed amid the cheering. He quietly lamented that he was desperately thirsty, when suddenly, a leather water skin was thrown from the stands, shattering at his feet and sending droplets spraying, causing the fighter to tilt his head back to watch the cascading water with an unmistakable, aching longing on his sweat-speckled face. Back in the deadly arena, the referee in clown garb swept his arm and loudly introduced the next slave sword fight, enthusiastically announcing the arrival of a massive, shaggy-bearded fighter named Lucas, nicknamed the Glory Lance, a former knight from Dinble who once felled 10 opponents with a single powerful strike. The muscular giant strode confidently into the ring with a large spear and sturdy shield as the crowd roared wildly. The giant Lucas moved to stand towering, blotting out the sun before the bowed black-haired youth. He bared his crooked teeth in a sneering, mocking chuckle, while the clown referee loudly gestured toward the black-haired man to continue introducing the opponent to the giant. Despite the crowd in the stands continually hurling insults and jeers, saying they were sick of his matches and cursing him to die, some even certain that even if he were the absolute king he would perish against Lucas today, the black-haired man calmly stepped forward with an untroubled, composed expression. Only then did the referee loudly proclaim him as the absolute king, Gil. Gil's face was magnified to reveal deep, dull eyes carrying a terrifying stillness. As the referee swept his arm and shouted that the match had officially begun, the vast arena fell into tense silence with the two fighters facing each other at a distance, and the giant Lucas began to take a deep breath to gather strength for his attack. Lucas braced himself, stepped back, and swung his sharp spear behind him to concentrate power so forcefully the ground trembled. He opened his mouth and roared savagely, inciting the crowd into another frenzy of cheering. Yet faced with that overwhelming momentum, Gil stood motionless, observing with hollow, indifferent eyes. Gil let out a soft breath as the opponent prepared to charge. The referee continued to rile the crowd, shouting that Glory Lance Lucas's full power strike had arrived, and Gil could not possibly evade it. But at that moment Gil's eyes suddenly snapped wide and sharp, his body tensed so the ground beneath him cracked, while luminous energy veins began to run along his muscles and through the shackles on his limbs, readying him for combat. As soon as the match began, Lucas charged and thrust his spear with devastating force at Gil, causing a huge explosion of dust and smoke. The giant curled his lip in a smug smile as if he had finished his foe, but then his eyes widened in shock, and the crowd fell into stunned horror when they saw Gil still standing unharmed in place. Seeing his weapon held fast by Gil and unable to move it, Lucas began to break out in a cold sweat. The stands erupted in confusion as people shouted that Lucas should stop playing around. Feeling humiliated, the giant cursed in anger, gritted his teeth, poured all his strength into his arms, and thrust the spear forward with a mad roar to force Gil to take the blow. Unable to pierce Gil with ordinary force, Lucas leapt high and brought the spear down in a decisive overhead strike, declaring the match over. Yet Gil merely glanced up and coolly tilted his head to dodge the flurry of lightning-fast thrusts without exerting any effort, which drove Lucas further into a furious, sweat-drenched rage as he gripped the spear shaft. Driven to the edge, Lucas wildly drove the spear's tip into the ground, creating violent tremors to assault Gil. The audience gaped in astonishment at the spectacle, but in that instant Gil drew the short sword at his side, moved with blistering speed behind Lucas, and slashed a killing blow that felled the giant. Lucas stood stunned, not yet understanding what had happened, when blood spurted from the mortal wound on his head and body, and the giant collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud signaling a tragic end. The crowd fell silent in shock. Then the clown referee swept his arms and proclaimed once more that the victor was Gil. The legend of the absolute king had added another legendary chapter to the blazing arena. Contrary to the victor's glory, the crowd was furious, tearing up their betting slips and shouting curses about heavy losses, claiming the match was fixed. Ignoring the venomous shouts around him, Gil quietly looked up at the blazing sun and lifted the nearly empty water skin. A tiny drop fell into his mouth, leaving him hollow and prompting him to toss the skin aside and mutter that he was still very thirsty. The crowd's anger peaked as they began hurling stones, leftover food, and trash into the arena, accompanied by curses telling Gil to die quickly. Despite the shower of bricks and stones, Gil did not look back or show any concern. He trudged wearily toward the dark, massive stone gate that stood ajar, returning him to his prison. Back in the cold, dark cell, Gil sat dazed on the stone bed while his calloused, scarred hands were once again bound by heavy iron chains. The dungeon silence was shattered by a loud clatter as a huge tray of lavish food, roasted turkey, plump grapes and baked pastries, was shoved through the iron slot into the cell. Standing outside the bars was a fat, noble slave owner bedecked in jewelry, holding a bottle of wine and laughing mockingly as he loudly praised Gil for earning him a pile of money today. The slave owner gleefully tossed the wine bottle through the bars into the cell and smugly declared it a special reward, a 10-year vintage for him. Inside the dark cell, Gil silently tore into the turkey drumstick and tilted back the wine without showing any emotion. The fat slave owner raised his arms to the sky and shouted into the cell, asking if the food was good. But when no answer came, he peered in and went pale with anger to find Gil sprawled on the floor, snoring contentedly. Feeling scorned, he pointed at Gil and ground his teeth, cursing that the man wouldn't properly enjoy the dishes he had painstakingly prepared. Finally, he turned and stomped off with the guards, contemptuously leaving. "Even if you're hailed as the absolute king, you're still just my lowly slave." The fat slave owner spat on the sleeping Gil in disgust and warned him not to act up. After all, he was only a gladiator slave, then launched into an explanation of their status. Gladiator slaves were forced to slaughter one another for the audience's amusement. If ordered, they had to fight anyone. If they thrilled the crowd, they might survive another day. Their will or character meant nothing, and defeat led only to death. The sight of other slaves clearing Lucas's corpse from the arena made this cruelty even clearer. Lying in the cell, Gil thought to himself that he was ultimately just a disposable plaything. He recalled surviving in this brutal arena world for over 10 years and realized that the title Absolute King meant nothing because he would always remain a slave. He had grown used to a routine of fighting and sleeping for 10 years and had thought that was fine. Yet Gil swallowed and wondered when the constant dryness in his throat had become so painfully unbearable. The cold moonlight through the window underscored his aching thirst. Lost in thought, Gil suddenly heard crackling sounds in the stillness. He frowned as a burnt smell drifted through the air and wondered if there was a fire. Gil slowly opened his eyes and sat up on the stone bed, peering through the cell bars with a calm, curious look. The corridor outside the dungeon was now engulfed in raging, chaotic flames, the ferocious fire devouring everything and spreading everywhere, sending the prisoners in other cells into panic as they desperately clung to the bars and screamed for help in vain while the deathly blaze closed in. Amid the blazing chaos, 2 hooded guards fled frantically down the corridor, ignoring the slaves' screams begging them not to leave them to burn. One guard even turned and shouted for the slaves to shut up and urged his companion to escape. Suddenly, a loud explosion rang out with agonized screams, throwing the 2 guards to the ground. As the smoke cleared, Gil still stood silently behind the bars, calmly watching the charred corpse of the unfortunate soul at his cell door. In the opposite cell, a muscular man battered the scorching bars in desperation, wailing that he didn't want to die here and hating the idea of dying as a slave. Hearing this, Gil murmured the word freedom and wondered what his own will meant, while the other man continued sobbing that he was human and longed to live freely by his own will, not obey anyone's orders. Those cries seemed to awaken something deep within Gil, bringing bloody, chain-filled memories to the surface. He questioned whether his freedom and will still existed. Gil swallowed hard, and his usually dull eyes suddenly widened, bright and full of life as he realized the dry thirst in his throat had somehow vanished. At that moment, the massive stone ceiling in the corridor began to crack and collapse where the slave was screaming, causing him to scream in terror. Gil's attention sharpened with determined resolve to protect the man. The slave hugged his head in despair awaiting death, but in that instant Gil strained his arm and shattered the iron shackle that had restrained him into fragments. Without another second's hesitation, Gil lunged forward to shield the cowering slave, unleashing a thunderous punch with overwhelming force that pulverized the falling boulders. The blow's immense power not only scattered the rubble but tore a huge hole through the arena's sturdy wall, creating a great shock that ripped through the night and blew away the raging inferno within. The lucky slave, stunned alive, looked up at the starry sky glittering through the enormous breach in the wall, stammering in confusion at what had just happened. He stared in amazement at Gil's towering back, standing proudly against the night wind. Gil turned his face, hidden in shadow, and asked the man if he could now live by his own will. The slave quickly bowed his head to the ground and answered a firm yes. Hearing that, Gil simply said, "Is that so?" then stepped forward to begin his own life of freedom. Standing on the ruined rampart of the arena, Gil silently cast his gaze over the vast natural panorama, rolling hills and a winding river beneath a star-filled night sky, while behind him the entire arena and district burned in towering black smoke, signaling the collapse of the place that had imprisoned him for years. Gil's eyes widened, reflecting the starlight with awe and deep emotion at the vast beauty of the outside world. He parted his lips and wondered vaguely whether this was the freedom he had long yearned for. Wasting no more time, Gil let himself jump down from the towering wall, landing lightly and steadily on the grass, then calmly set off toward the forest, telling himself to walk a while and simply savor this feeling of freedom. As he walked slowly through the forest, Gil muttered and pondered his uncertain future. He had no food, no shelter, no clear purpose, and didn't know what awaited him. Yet his eyes were resolute, convinced he was no longer a slave and that no one could bind him anymore. He thought matter-of-factly that if people called him the absolute king, he might as well live under that name. His immediate goal was to find a place without slavery, and perhaps the neighboring kingdom of Pastel would be the first destination for this journey. The scene shifted to a mysterious, dense magical forest with giant mushrooms and glowing strange plants. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the silence, drawing Gil's immediate attention. He crouched into the underbrush, peered into the distance, and discovered a girl desperately using a honeycomb-shaped magical shield to fend off an aggressive pack of wolf-like beasts. A close-up revealed the girl was a beautiful blonde sorceress. She clenched one eye shut, teeth gritted, sweat soaking her face as she strained with both hands to hold her staff and maintain the fragile barrier, while the wolf-like beasts outside bared fangs and raked wildly with claws trying to break the defensive wall and devour her. Hidden in the underbrush, Gil calmly watched and silently assessed the situation. It was the sorceress's shield, and the girl was besieged by monsters. Seeing the girl sobbing in fear and exhausted before those razor-toothed jaws, Gil half smiled, realizing that whether to save her now was entirely his free choice. With resolute will he decided to intervene, marking the official turning point that would open the unparalleled adventure of the strongest former slave. Back amid the tense action in the forest, the pack of spined wolf beasts kept ferociously pressing the attack, causing the sorceress's magical barrier to develop long, spider-web-like cracks. The girl flinched in panic when she heard the cracking sound beside her, and the worst came when a savage wolf swung its claws in a powerful strike that shattered the protective wall, sending magical shards flying like broken glass. With her protection gone, the sorceress squeezed her eyes shut, curled up, screamed once and clutched her head awaiting the pack to leap and tear her apart. But at that hair-raising moment Gil dashed in with terrifying speed, snatched the staff from her hands, planted himself defiantly in front of her, and swung the staff decisively, producing slashing lethal blasts that severed the space itself and forced the frenzied beasts to recoil in fear. Gil thrust his right arm forward and unleashed an overwhelmingly powerful arc of magical energy, an attack so forceful it rent the air and instantly sliced the savage wolf pack into fragments mid-air, while his left hand still held the sorceress's staff to protect the huddled girl behind him, thus opening Chapter 2 of the fierce battle in the deep woods. The severed bodies of the wolves rained down around the two of them. The blonde sorceress slowly opened her eyes and felt something hit her head. When she realized it was a bloodied piece of a wolf's head, she shrieked and fell backward, staring in astonishment at the scattered carcasses of the beasts across the grass, not understanding what had happened, while Gil remained calm, watching her. The sorceress clasped her hands and looked up at the sky with sparkling eyes, fancifully believing she had unleashed a terrifying power to destroy the pack. Seeing this, Gil asked if she was okay, startling her into turning around and blankly asking who he was. After Gil introduced himself calmly, she beamed with self-satisfaction, pointed at him and said he was very lucky. If not for her, he would have died. Gil was speechless, eyeballing her and half-heartedly humoring her delusion. The blonde girl cheerfully introduced herself as Misha, an E-rank adventurer currently experiencing a surge of latent talent to slay monsters. Gil, puzzled, asked what an adventurer was, and Misha, surprised, began to explain that it's a job taking commissions from guilds to hunt monsters or gather rare materials for money. Gil nodded, thinking it sounded like hard work, but Misha smiled and added that background didn't matter in this line of work. If you had strength, you could earn big sums. Misha spread her arms proudly and excitedly declared that being an adventurer was the freest profession in the world. She emphasized that the job bound no one and adventurers could freely decide where to go, what to do, or whom to fight for, so it was an amazing occupation. Those words about absolute freedom struck deep in Gil's mind, causing him to look up silently at the sky and softly repeat the phrase, "the freest profession in the world," with a contemplative expression. After a pause, Gil asked Misha how one could become an adventurer. Misha put a hand to her chin to think and instructed him that recently there was an adventurers' guild in the kingdom of Pastel, located in the city of Sadra, where he could register. But as Gil hesitated, she bluntly rejected the idea. Surprised, he asked why, and Misha stared at his body with an embarrassed look as they stood amid the field of carcasses. Misha pointed out that Gil didn't even have a single weapon for self-defense, while adventuring required strength to fight monsters. She assessed his muscular build and suggested he equip a long sword to fight. Gil lightly put a hand to his chin to ponder weapons when Misha suddenly panicked and urged him not to stand there chatting because an A-rank monster called Kaiser Kong had appeared in this area. Gil blinked and asked what that rank meant, leaving Misha speechless. She hadn't expected him to lack such basic knowledge. Misha began explaining that the ranking system classifies the strength of both adventurers and monsters from highest to lowest, S to F. She emphasized that S rank is as dangerous as a natural disaster and will certainly take the life of any human unfortunate enough to encounter it. Gil stroked his chin and curiously asked if any such monsters were in this forest. Misha nodded and urged him to leave immediately, warning that one must never confront Kaiser Kong. Gil nonchalantly asked what the monster looked like, and Misha described it as a giant gorilla with jet black fur and its whole body crackling with lightning. Gil pressed for more details, asking if it had horns and stood about 3 meters tall, which made Misha nod and repeatedly praise his quick grasp of the information. At that moment, Gil pointed forward with a finger and asked if the monster resembled the thing standing over there, leaving Misha stunned and uncomprehending. Before she could react, a massive furry fist slammed into the ground, shaking the entire forest. A colossal black gorilla with sharp white horns and crackling bolts of lightning around its body slowly stepped out of the undergrowth right before Gil and Misha. It bared jagged teeth and let out a deafening, furious roar that threatened the two small figures. The roar of the A-rank monster Kaiser Kong producing a terrible pressure that blew away the brush and trees, signaling an unavoidable life-or-death confrontation. Misha turned pale with fear, tears welling and trembling as she stumbled backward. She could hardly believe her eyes that such a terrifying A-rank monster as Kaiser Kong had truly appeared before them. Wasting no time, she shouted for Gil to run away immediately. But the giant gorilla roared fiercely and charged at terrifying speed toward Gil, prompting Misha to scream in desperate alarm. A thunderous impact rocked the earth as Kaiser Kong drove its immense weight into the attack, yet through the swirling dust Gil stood firm, shielding Misha behind him. He used his bare hands to catch the beast's furry, lightning-charged fist directly. Misha was utterly shocked to see Gil stop such a devastating blow with his bare hands, while Gil tilted his mouth in a confident smile and calmly remarked that the attack was rather decent. Facing the beast, his gaze sharp and composed, Gil told himself he had the choice to flee or fight in this situation, and then a thrilled smile spread across his face, revealing his decision. Misha behind him continued to wail and beg him to run or he would be killed, but Gil tightened his fist. Bright veins of energy began to glow and run along the bands wrapped around his arms, signaling a powerful counterattack. Without hesitation, Gil swung his left arm with all his strength and knocked Kaiser Kong's enormous fist aside. The counterforce was so strong that the giant gorilla lost momentum and staggered backward onto its back. Misha gaped in astonishment, speechless at witnessing a human, using only raw strength, knock back such a huge monster. She stared at Gil's steady back and kept wondering what kind of god he might be. Kaiser Kong quickly regained its balance, roared in furious rage, and charged to slam both massive fists into the ground, intending to crush Gil. But Gil nimbly stepped back to evade, prompting Misha to cry out in alarm that its attacks seemed to have no effect on him. The monster continued flurries of punches at Gil, but he calmly and skillfully dodged them with ease. Seizing an opening when Kaiser Kong exposed a weakness, Gil lunged forward and delivered a powerful punch straight to its face, sending the creature flipping backward. It responded immediately by swinging a gigantic arm and striking Gil's left side. Though hit, Gil did not falter. He merely twitched a brow, smiled, and then unleashed a rapid barrage of punches with both hands at lightning speed, creating afterimages as they struck the monster's chest. The battle was fierce as Gil and Kaiser Kong exchanged blow for blow, unleashing successive attacks with destructive force that shook the whole forest. Excitement showed on Gil's face as he fought freely for the first time, while the beast roared back in madness. Watching the horrific clash between two beings far stronger than ordinary people, Misha, standing at a distance, could feel an enormous pressure that made the air itself tremble. She could only gasp in amazement, wondering what kind of terrifying combat this was. Gil deftly dodged a lethal strike, used the momentum to spring into the air at dizzying speed, landed precisely and firmly on Kaiser Kong's back, then smiled slightly and declared the game over, after which he clasped both hands into a hammer and brought a crushing blow down on the beast's skull. He raised his arms, straining as crackling arcs of magical lightning raced across them. His face showed terrifying focus and composure, while the creature below screamed in pain and panic. Misha watched every move with wide eyes, and then Gil struck a double hammer blow down onto Kaiser Kong's back, creating a tremendous explosion of power. Kaiser Kong screamed in agony and thrashed, swinging a fist to try to fling Gil off its back, but he quickly grabbed a handful of its fur to steady himself. It writhed and leapt madly to dislodge him, yet Gil held on tight, leaving Misha dumbfounded and unsure what he planned to do next. Finally, Gil released one hand. It began to glow brilliantly as dense streams of magical energy converged, and he coldly declared the battle over as he prepared to deliver the finishing blow. The fight reached its climax when Gil reached out, grabbed Kaiser Kong's spine, and pulled with all his strength, causing the monster to scream in agony. Witnessing the horror, Misha's eyes bulged in terror as Gil used overwhelming force to rip the massive spine out of the beast's body, spraying fresh blood everywhere. Without its spine, Kaiser Kong collapsed to the ground with a loud thud and died on the spot. Misha sank to the ground, hands over her mouth, trembling and unable to believe her eyes. She had thought he would fight it hand to hand, not literally pull out its spine. Gil casually shook the bloody spine to clean it off, while Misha continued to sweat profusely, wondering aloud what kind of monster this man truly was. Gil hoisted the gigantic bone onto his shoulder, then turned and called Misha's name. She jumped and stammered a hurried reply, and Gil smiled confidently, saying that if a weapon were a greatsword, he already had one. He held the spiky backbone out before her and asked if this would qualify him to become an adventurer. Still shaken and sweating, Misha timidly answered yes. Hearing that, Gil nodded with satisfaction and asked Misha to guide him to the city of Sadra. She obediently agreed since she was headed there as well. Before she could brace herself, Gil suddenly tucked Misha under his arm and nonchalantly said they should depart at once. Then he slung the bone sword over his shoulder and raced off at terrifying speed through the treetops, leaving Misha screaming and begging him to put her down, thus closing Chapter 2 of the story. Cut to a bustling district with a beautiful fountain. Gil now wore a neat adventurer's outfit, waistcoat and knee-length trousers, and shaded his eyes with his hand as he looked up at a large building topped with a canopy shaped like a tent. Misha walked beside him, exhaling in relief and saying they had finally arrived. Gil muttered, wondering if this was the Adventurers' Guild, marking the moment he would knock on the door and step into a new world. Misha wiped sweat from her brow and complained that they'd run into a lot of trouble getting here. She recounted how guards had stopped Gil at the city gate because he looked like a savage slave, and how he had terrified a tailor when he tried to pay with monster hide instead of currency. Gil looked away sheepishly and admitted he'd caused trouble for her, but Misha quickly smiled, waved it off, saying at least he'd bought decent clothes, and urged him to hurry into the guild. Before they stepped through the great door bearing the guild emblem, Misha carefully reminded Gil that once he registered, he would receive an adventurer's card as identification, and could earn money by taking on missions. However, she immediately grew very serious and raised a finger to warn him never to cause trouble or use violence inside the guild. Gil listened calmly, nodded that he understood, then resolutely reached out and pushed the wooden door open. As the door swung wide, a noisy, bustling air rushed over Gil. Inside the guild was a vast hall crowded with adventurers of every rank gathered around round tables, drinking ale and chatting loudly. All eyes inside turned toward the main entrance as Gil, tall and broad, entered slowly carrying the bizarre bone sword with little Misha at his side, marking the official turning point as the strongest one joined the adventurer world. Scanning the bustling guild hall, Gil inwardly marveled that this place was more lively than anything he'd seen. He wondered if this was the freest job in the world and felt a deep sense of freedom forming. Seeing him stand dazed, Misha smiled and urged him to register as an adventurer quickly, confidently insisting that with his strength Gil would surely become an excellent adventurer. Misha proudly patted her chest and declared that, as an E-rank adventurer, she would vouch for him, so the two of them went inside. But as they passed the rows of tables, they immediately attracted the attention of rude adventurers drinking ale. They began pointing and whispering about the strange bone sword Gil carried and sneered, asking whether a flashy newbie planned to use that to hunt monsters, prompting Misha to press a hand to her forehead and sigh in annoyance. Misha hurriedly leaned close to Gil, advising him to ignore the drunks and sternly warning that even if provoked he must not cause trouble in the guild or he'd lose his right to register as an adventurer. Gil frowned at the fuss and cheekily asked if he could fight back if they attacked first, which made Misha angry as she waved her hand and scolded him not to apply that savage logic here. While they were talking, a burly man with a rough face stepped forward to block their path and called out in a provocative tone. The burly man with short hair held a beer bottle, and beside him stood a bearded companion with a scarred face. They blocked the way and complained that ignoring a senior's words was disrespectful. The scarred man smugly patted a shoulder and preached the adventurer rules. Those who came before them held supreme power, and arrogant newcomers who didn't know the rules were the most despicable. Gil remained calm and replied that he was about to register and didn't yet know the rules, which made the burly man snort contemptuously and demand that Gil learn his place and obediently apologize. Not content with taunts, the burly man grabbed Misha's arm and yanked her toward him, trying to grope the pretty-faced girl. Misha blushed in fear and struggled, shouting for him to let go, but the scarred companion barked at her to shut up and obey. Seeing the woman beside him being bullied, Gil's brow tightened, his gaze turned icy, and he muttered the word obey with extreme displeasure. Sensing Gil's different attitude, the scarred man sneered and asked if he had any objections. Gil only raised a hand to touch his throat lightly and thought to himself that his thirst seemed to be stirring again. The scarred man grew even more brazen, jabbing a finger into Gil's face and declaring that the rule here was whatever they said. He arrogantly imposed that from now on Gil and Misha would be their slaves, and the word slave darkened Gil's eyes when it was spoken once more. Rage exploded within Gil as he coldly asked them whether they intended to steal his freedom once again. Killing intent poured from Gil, forming a huge, terrifying shadow with blazing eyes that filled the space, causing the two thugs to break into a cold sweat and hastily release Misha. Gil immersed himself in the deathly darkness and declared in a hard voice that he would never forgive anyone who dared to take his freedom. Overwhelmed by the horrible killing aura, the two adventurers recoiled in fear, sweating profusely and wondering why this newbie suddenly seemed so immense. Misha panicked and stretched out her arms to stop Gil from causing a scene, but he slung his arm over his shoulder, gripped the haft of the bone sword, and told himself he was here to live a free life and would let no one stand in his way. He tightened his fist and gathered his strength to unleash a brutal punishment on those who dared call him a slave. Just as Gil prepared to strike, a massive, powerfully built man with long, light-colored hair and countless scars crisscrossing his face appeared at blinding speed and caught Gil's fist with one hand, producing a loud impact. Misha gasped, calling him the guildmaster, and the two thugs also startled and cried the same. The guildmaster smiled and asked what the commotion was, while Gil frowned slightly, surprised and privately nodding this opponent's considerable strength for having slipped behind him unnoticed. The entire guild hall fell silent as the guildmaster Rindo appeared. The two thugs, suddenly nervous, pointed at Gil and hastily fabricated that they were only kindly teaching newcomer rules, claiming Gil had attacked them first. Rindo heard this, turned stern, and asked Gil if those claims were true. Gil remained calm and unflinching, replying that he had only come to register as an adventurer and had done nothing, leaving Misha beside him sweating with worry. Rindo crossed his arms and suggested that troublemakers who acted before registering needed to prove themselves by force. He challenged Gil to defeat him to prove his strength, prompting gasps of astonishment from those nearby. Gil curled his lip in a faint smile and considered the offer to beat the guildmaster an amusing joke. Rindo smiled challengingly and said he wanted to see whether Gil was truly skilled or merely a loud braggart. Gil maintained a calm, confident expression while Misha stood behind him, clutching her head in worry as the situation threatened to spiral out of control. The scene then shifted to a large circular training arena within the Adventurers Guild grounds, with many people gathering in the stands to watch. Standing in the center of the wide training ground, Rindo spread his arms and proclaimed the rules. Both sides would use weapons, and whoever fell or surrendered first would lose. He pointed to the weapon rack and told Gil to choose any weapon. Misha stood by the rack, which held many swords and axes, inviting him to choose, but Gil only glanced and moved toward a gigantic greatsword, prompting Rindo to curiously ask if he intended to pick that one. Rindo stepped forward, lifted the huge greatsword, and with one hand swung it lightly, producing a powerful gust that made the crowd marvel at the guildmaster's strength. The two earlier thugs smugly boasted that Rindo had been a top A-rank adventurer and that no one in the area could defeat him, mocking that the rookie Gil must regret his arrogance. Misha, terrified by the opponent's overwhelming power, still clasped her hands and shouted encouragement for Gil. Seeing Gil raise his strange bone sword, Rindo asked in surprise if he really intended to fight with it. Gil nodded calmly and confidently affirmed that it was his reliable partner, which made Rindo give a pleased, soft exclamation. The crowd and the thugs seized the chance to ridicule Gil, claiming a rotten bone segment could never stand up to a proper weapon and would snap instantly. Ignoring the jeers, the female receptionist waved and announced that the qualification match for guild registration between Guildmaster Rindo and Gil would officially begin. The moment the match announcement rang out, Rindo lunged forward and unleashed a devastating aerial slash, but Gil did not flinch. He quickly raised the bone sword to block the powerful strike, sending sparks flying and shockwaves throughout the arena. Rindo grinned with excitement, telling Gil not to be so hasty, and secretly wiped sweat as he realized the weapon in Gil's hand, though merely a chunk of bone, possessed an unbelievable hardness. Gil shoved with force against the greatsword, causing Rindo to skid back several steps. The thugs in the stands stubbornly insisted Rindo had been holding back, having assumed the match would end in a single blow. While Misha watched anxiously, Rindo beamed with excitement, praised Gil for fighting well, and declared he would begin fighting seriously. Immediately, Rindo's gigantic sword burst into blazing flames, radiating intense heat, yet Gil stood calmly to face it without a trace of fear. Rindo lunged forward and thrust with a blazing, powerful flame toward Gil, forcing him to raise the bone sword to block and brace against the terrible pressure. Not stopping there, Rindo spun and delivered a tremendous punch into the bone sword, producing a massive energy explosion that blasted everything around and sent dazzling streaks of energy sweeping across the entire arena. The receptionist excitedly shouted through the megaphone that the critical strike had hit, while the crowd shielded their faces from the storm. Yet when the dust cleared, Gil still stood firm, using the bone sword to fully stop Rindo's full-power attack, leaving everyone stunned at the unexpected turn of events. Rindo smiled, admitting Gil's defensive skill was excellent and pleasantly surprised, but he also tensed, preparing to unleash his strongest technique. Rindo poured all his strength into swinging the greatsword in a dizzying spin, generating a gigantic whirl of sword chi that compressed the surrounding air like a vortex. The strike's force was so great that spectators high above gasped as they felt the pressure tearing through the space toward them. Misha shouted frantically for Gil to be careful as Rindo roared his name with full vigor, and Gil calmly responded, ready to meet the decisive blow. Rindo swung the flaming greatsword down and shouted the skill name, Blazing Wind 5 Cuts. The receptionist eagerly announced over the loudspeaker that it was a 5-hit combo with terrifying speed capable of cutting anything. Yet Gil remained composed, legs planted wide, and thrust the bone sword forward to absorb the full force of the attack, producing countless electric sparks and violent shockwaves that ripped the ground apart. Rindo gritted his teeth, driving his full body weight down to press the giant sword hard in an attempt to overwhelm his opponent. But Gil steadfastly braced with bent knees, using the bone sword to withstand that blazing onslaught without flinching. Suddenly Gil erupted in counterforce, channeling lightning energy into his hands and flinging Rindo's greatsword high into the air, completely breaking the guildmaster's offensive. Rindo lost momentum, fell backward and spat a mouthful of blood from the heavy impact, while Gil, his face shrouded in deadly shadow and cold eyes flashing, prepared to swing down with a finishing blow to end the fight. Seeing that, Misha screamed in sheer terror, begging Gil not to kill the guildmaster, but Gil coldly brought the enormous bone sword crashing into the ground with a mortal strike, creating a horrific explosion that devastated the arena and filled the air with blinding dust. Rindo lay on the ground, eyes wide in shock, staring at the destructive blow that had just fallen with an expression of incredulous disbelief. As the smoke and dust slowly cleared, the scene revealed that Gil had intentionally controlled his power and stopped the giant bone sword mere millimeters from Rindo's throat. Rindo lay on his back in a deep pit, sweating profusely and staring at the jagged blade before him, still stunned. From above, Gil stood guarding the sword, solemnly looking down with his usual calm demeanor, while Misha and the two thugs outside the arena gaped in silent astonishment at the unbelievable outcome. The receptionist stammered for a moment, then loudly declared the match over and that the overwhelming victor was Gil. The crowd and the thugs were stunned to realize Gil had defeated even the strongest guildmaster and trembled with sweat, wondering what kind of monster this newcomer could be. Rindo lay on the ground, breathing hard, then unexpectedly smiled as he admitted his defeat and quietly thought no wonder the thugs earlier had been so terrified of this fellow. Rindo stood, walked over, draped an arm over Gil's shoulder, smiled broadly, and loudly declared before the entire guild that as guildmaster he would make an exception and recognize Gil as a C-rank adventurer. The crowd was utterly astonished and abuzz, since normally it took 5 years of effort to reach C-rank, and a newbie immediately receiving such a high rank was unprecedented. Ignoring the chatter, Rindo loudly congratulated the birth of a new adventurer and wished Gil good luck on his path to freedom, while Gil could only awkwardly repeat to himself that he just wanted to register normally. Scattered applause began and quickly swelled into a crisp ovation and frenzied cheers from everyone in the guild hall. They were exhilarated, praising the great match and sincerely congratulating Gil on achieving C rank, leaving him dumbfounded and frozen, unsure of what was happening. Gil glanced around at the crowd cheering and smiling for him, and quietly wondered how long it had been since he'd last been immersed in such a warm, recognition-filled atmosphere. Receiving the sincere applause and Misha's radiant, proud smile as she waved both hands at him from afar, Gil's heart felt warmed, and the cold face of the one once called the absolute king unexpectedly softened into a gentle, peaceful smile. He quietly savored the joy of being recognized not as a killing tool in a prison arena, but as a free person, formally closing the first chapter and opening a promising, unparalleled journey as an adventurer.